The pilot claimed it was an accident, just a spilled cup of tea, but 6 minutes later, vengeance brewed stronger than coffee, and every pot overflowed with blood. What happens next will leave you speechless. When pain spills, so does truth. Subscribe if you stand against hate and cover-ups. The first tremor hit just as Reese Mallory adjusted the baby carrier strap across his shoulder. It wasn't violent, but sharp enough to make the overhead bins rattle and the cabin lights flicker for a brief second. Reese instinctively cupped his hand behind his 6-month-old son's head, steadying the baby's fragile neck as the plane dipped slightly before leveling again. Aiden stirred with a soft cry, his face scrunching against his father's chest, but Reese whispered gently, brushing a knuckle across the boy's cheek. "You're all right. Just a little bump," he murmured, his voice low and steady. The seatbelt sign dinged overhead, flashing back on. A flight attendant moved briskly down the aisle, checking that passengers had complied, offering polite but rushed nods. From the front of the plane, the cockpit door clicked open. Captain Jarek Danton stepped out. It wasn't customary. Pilots rarely left the cockpit during turbulence unless absolutely necessary. Yet here he was, tall, broad-shouldered, and expressionless. He adjusted the cuffs of his sleeves as he slowly walked down the aisle, nodding curtly to a few passengers as if on patrol. Reese watched the man approach. Something about the pilot's stride was off. Too controlled, too deliberate. As Jarek neared, his eyes settled on the baby bundled against Reese's chest. His gaze lingered, longer than it should have. Cold, measured. Reese offered a small, courteous nod. "We're good here, thanks." Jarek didn't smile. "Can't have kids crying the whole flight," he muttered, almost too softly to hear. Reese blinked, unsure if he'd heard right. "Excuse me?" But Jarek had already shifted his attention elsewhere. He continued his walk, inspecting the cabin, then disappeared behind the curtain separating first class from the galley. Reese frowned, bouncing Aiden gently. The baby's whimper had softened, but the tension hadn't. There was something in that moment, something Reese couldn't name yet, but it prickled at the back of his mind like static before a storm. Across the aisle, a businessman adjusted his laptop, oblivious. Another passenger scrolled through a tablet. Nothing looked out of place, and yet the air felt heavier. Moments later, Reese caught a glimpse of Jarek again, just beyond the galley curtain. The captain was leaning in close to one of the flight attendants, young, lean, and jittery, whose name tag read Milo. Jarek whispered something sharply. Milo nodded once, his face stiffening, then stepped into the galley. Jarek followed behind him. The curtain swayed slightly as they vanished from view. Reese shifted in his seat, adjusting Aiden's blanket. The baby stirred again and let out a muffled cry. Reese leaned down, humming a soft tune his wife used to sing, a melody that now echoed more like a memory than comfort. "I know, buddy. I miss her too." The soft overhead hum of the plane continued, masking the subtle unease rippling beneath the calm. Milo returned moments later, pushing a small beverage cart. He reached Reese's row and paused. "Water and a blanket, please," Reese requested, his tone polite but edged with concern. "My son's just a little unsettled." "Of course," Milo said, his voice tight. He handed over the items mechanically, as though following a checklist. Reese noticed the tremble in his hand, the way his eyes briefly flicked toward the galley. Then, without warning, Captain Jarek reappeared. This time he carried a silver pot, steam visibly rising from its spout. Reese assumed it was part of the drink service, but the sight of the pilot himself holding it felt strange, unnecessary. Jarek stepped closer, unusually close. His expression was unreadable, his eyes locked not on Reese, but on Aiden. "You know," the captain began, tone flat, "people forget how disruptive even small sounds can be at altitude." Reese looked up sharply, defensive now. "He's an infant. He's not being disruptive. Just a little scared." Jarek tilted his head as if amused. "Of course," he replied with a clipped smile. Then it happened. The pilot shifted his weight, made a sudden jerking motion, tripping, supposedly, his foot catching on the lip of the service cart. The pot tipped. Reese barely had time to move. A splash of boiling tea arced through the air and landed directly on Aiden's shoulder and neck. The sound that followed would haunt every passenger in that cabin for years. Aiden's scream, raw, high-pitched, and pure agony, pierced the air like a siren. Reese's eyes went wide in horror. He stood up instantly, clutching his son, but the baby was already writhing against him. the exposed skin blistering red in seconds. Towels. Ice. Voices shouting. Milo appeared with a cloth, stammering something about an accident. Another attendant rushed forward, but Reese was focused only on his child, on the pain in Aiden's face, on the searing burn that marred his skin. He turned toward Jarek, who stood motionless. His hands were dry. His face was calm. And though his mouth was set in a neutral line, there was something in his eyes that chilled Reese to his core. Not remorse, not panic, contempt. "It was a mistake," Jarek said, wiping his sleeve slowly as if brushing away dust. Reese felt rage building in his throat, but he forced his voice steady. "I need medical assistance. Now, emergency landing. Get us down." Milo picked up the intercom handset, whispered something. There was a pause. Too long. Reese's eyes darted between the flight attendants and the pilot, searching for someone, anyone, who looked alarmed enough to act. But no one did. Instead, the plane remained steady, cruising calmly through the sky. No announcements, no diversion. Aiden's cries quieted to shallow whimpers, his tiny body pressed against Reese's chest as he wrapped the baby tightly in his blazer, trying to shield him from the cold air and the stairs. Then, from the seat across the aisle, a napkin was discreetly passed toward him. Reese looked up to see a man, late 30s, with a composed but serious face, give him a quick nod. Reese took the napkin, unfolding it under the blanket. A single message, scrawled in uneven ink. They did this before. Document everything. Reese stared at the note, his heart slamming against his ribs. The baby trembled against him. Jarek returned to the galley. Somewhere behind that curtain he poured himself another drink. Reese's fingers closed tightly around the napkin. Something far worse than an accident had just occurred, and someone was watching to make sure it didn't get noticed. Not every storm is born in the clouds. The scalding sound of liquid hitting skin was sharp, almost louder than the infant's scream that followed. Reese jerked backward, instinct taking over as he clutched Aiden tightly to his chest. The boiling tea had struck his baby directly across the shoulder and upper chest. In the split second before his brain could process what had just happened, Reese's ears filled with the raw, high-pitched wail of his son in pain. The baby's tiny fists flailed weakly, his face turning red as the agony took hold. Reese's heart pounded like a war drum. "What did you just do?" he snapped, his voice shaking, eyes wide with disbelief as he looked up at Captain Jarek Danton. The captain stood over them, still gripping the now empty pot, steam rising from the rim. His eyes narrowed slightly, the corners of his mouth twitching upward for the briefest of moments before quickly flattening. I tripped," he said, though his voice lacked the panic or urgency of someone who had just poured boiling liquid on a child. His tone was dry, almost too calm. Passengers began to murmur. A man 2 rows back leaned into the aisle, trying to see what had happened. A woman across the aisle clapped a hand over her mouth. The air in the cabin shifted, still pressurized but now heavy with confusion and fear. Milo, the attendant who had previously brought refreshments, appeared beside Reese in a flash, clutching a stack of napkins and a packet of burn gel. "I'm so sorry, sir," he said quickly, kneeling down. "Let me help." "Get away from us," Reese growled, shielding Aiden from Milo's reach. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried weight. Aiden's cries had subsided into small, raspy whimpers, but Reese could see the angry red welt blooming across his skin. The blazer Reese had used to shield Aiden was damp and steaming. He peeled it back carefully, revealing the child's scalded skin, already starting to blister along the edge of his neck. Reese looked up again, eyes locked on the captain. "You tripped," he said, barely keeping his composure. "That pot didn't even wobble in your hands until you were right in front of me." Jarek didn't respond. He simply nodded once, handed the pot off to Milo without a word, and turned, walking back toward the galley. His gait was steady, not limping, not shaken, steady. Reese's breathing grew shallow as he cradled Aiden, whispering gently into his ear to soothe him. But inside, a different storm was rising. That wasn't an accident. No matter how much he wanted to believe it was just clumsiness or misjudged footing, the captain's demeanor told a different story. There was no apology, no urgency, no humanity in his reaction. He gently rocked Aiden in his arms, his mind now racing ahead. A child burned, a captain with a smirk, and a cabin full of witnesses too afraid or too confused to react. He needed help, medical help, and fast. Reese looked around the cabin, trying to find someone, anyone who might intervene, who might speak up, or who had seen it clearly enough to confirm what he knew in his gut. But no one moved. A few whispered, some glanced nervously toward the curtain separating first class from the galley. Others avoided his gaze entirely. "Flight attendant," Reese shouted. "I want the flight diverted now. My son needs emergency care." Milo returned, his face pale. "We're contacting the cockpit now. Just, please stay seated while we speak with the captain." Reese stared at him in disbelief. "You just saw what happened? My son was burned with boiling tea and you're asking me to stay calm while you ask permission to do your job?" Milo didn't answer. He nodded once, retreated again behind the curtain. Aiden stirred, letting out another weak cry. Reese's hand shook as he brushed sweat from his son's forehead. He didn't know what to do first. Press for an emergency landing? Demand medical aid? Start recording everything? His phone was in his pocket, but a sharp memory stopped him. Airline policies. Some carriers, Rilojet among them, had strict rules against cabin recording for the privacy of passengers and crew. A policy designed, he suspected, to serve more than just privacy. The curtain rustled. Milo peeked out. "Sir, we're monitoring the situation. The captain has noted it as an unfortunate accident and advised passengers to remain calm. We'll proceed as scheduled unless further complications arise." Reese almost laughed. "Unfortunate accident? That's what you're going with?" No answer. He looked down at Aiden again. The baby was half asleep now, dazed, his whimpers slowing. The pain was still there, but his body was shutting down, overwhelmed. Reese wrapped him gently in a clean cloth from his carry-on, then leaned back, rage simmering beneath the surface. This wasn't going to be swept under the rug. He didn't know what game was being played on this aircraft, but he'd find out. He'd document every word, every look, every lie they tried to sell him. The intercom dinged. "Ladies and gentlemen," came Jarek's voice, calm and rehearsed, "we'd like to apologize for a minor spill incident in the forward cabin. There is no danger to the aircraft or passengers. Please remain seated and enjoy the remainder of your flight." Minor spill? Reese's jaw tightened. The baby in his arms was injured, possibly scarred for life, and the captain, the man responsible, had just framed it like a coffee mishap on someone's slacks. He looked toward the curtain again where the captain had disappeared. Behind it, shadows moved, indistinct, but whispering. Milo's silhouette was stiff, rigid. Jarek's voice, low, sharp, controlled, cut through faintly. A single phrase slipped through. "Make sure it doesn't escalate." Reese blinked, pulse rising. It wasn't just arrogance, it was a cover-up. Aiden whimpered again, soft and small. Reese lowered his head, gently pressing his lips to his son's forehead. "I've got you," he whispered. "They don't know who they're dealing with." He slid his hand into his jacket pocket, feeling the weight of his phone. They said recordings were prohibited, but some truths demanded to be recorded, and Reese wasn't going to wait, because accidents don't usually smirk when they happen. Chaos erupted instantly. Reese's heart slammed into his ribs as he sprang to his feet, cradling his son in his arms. Aiden's high-pitched scream cut through the calm of the cabin, the kind of cry no parent should ever hear. Reese's hands shook, his grip tightening around his baby's fragile form as he looked down at the skin that had turned a deep crimson where the hot liquid had scalded it. The welt was large, stretching across Aiden's shoulder and down his neck, already starting to swell. His baby's skin, so tender, now marred by the burn. Reese's blood ran cold, and his mind screamed for immediate help. The flight attendants were in motion, huddling together, trying to find towels, ice packs, anything that could soothe the pain. But despite their efforts, the burning smell of scorched skin lingered in the air, a constant reminder of the agony Aiden was in. Behind them, Captain Jarek stood near the galley, still holding the pot of tea in his hands. His expression was blank, distant, his eyes scanning the cabin with an odd, almost amused look. He was wiping his hands casually as if cleaning up after a minor spill. Reese's anger ignited in a flash. He glanced at Aiden, whose cries had turned into shallow breaths, each one filled with pain. "Get me an emergency landing now," Reese demanded, his voice trembling with fury. Milo, one of the flight attendants, gave a quick nod and turned toward the intercom. But the seconds stretched into an uncomfortable silence, then another. Reese watched the attendant's movements, slow, deliberate, too controlled. There was something off, a delay, just enough to make him uneasy. He shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his hand never leaving Aiden's body, his eyes searching for something, anything that would explain the oddness of this moment. The plane continued to hum steadily, its engines purring through the altitude as if nothing had happened. No announcement came, no urgency in the captain's voice. Reese's mind raced. Why wasn't anything being done? He shifted his weight in the seat, trying to hold his son securely. The coldness in his chest grew, deepening with each passing moment. This wasn't just an accident. He had worked in high-stakes business meetings, navigated power struggles, and dealt with manipulative tactics in the corporate world, but nothing prepared him for this. Not this. From his peripheral vision, Reese caught a glimpse of the captain again. Jarek was behind the curtain now, seemingly untouched by the chaos that had just unfolded. He was sipping the tea, the same tea that had just been spilled across his son's delicate skin. Reese swallowed hard, his breath coming in shallow gasps. Was this an accident, or was it something worse? A voice to his left startled him. Bren Alton, the man who'd been sitting quietly in row 4C, leaned toward Reese. His face was serious, eyes narrowed. He slid something across the armrest, just a napkin, but it had something scribbled on it in faint ink. They did this before. Document everything. Reese's fingers trembled as he unfolded the napkin, reading the words quickly. The blood drained from his face. The words seemed like an accusation, a warning, and yet Reese couldn't shake the feeling that Bren had been waiting for this moment, for the plane to reveal itself. Suddenly, the weight of the situation hit Reese full force. This wasn't a random mistake. He had been targeted. There was a pattern here, something dark and methodical behind it all. His gaze flitted back to Aiden, whose cries had quieted, the poor baby drifting in and out of consciousness, his small body now limp against Reese's chest. The man next to him, Bren, didn't move but spoke again, his voice low, almost conspiratorial. They've been doing this on other flights, targeting specific people, executives, influential passengers with a certain profile. He glanced toward the back of the cabin, where the crew remained distant, indifferent. They've been suppressing reports, hiding the truth. Reese felt the blood surge in his veins as a storm of realization settled over him. This wasn't just about a burnt child. This was about something far bigger, something corporate, something systemic. A pattern of silence. The realization hit like a punch to the stomach. The captain, the crew, the delay, none of it was coincidence. Milo, a few steps away, glanced at Reese, his face tight with unease. "Sir," he said, trying to mask the tension in his voice, "we'll cooperate fully once we land." But Reese wasn't interested in waiting. Not anymore. His eyes locked onto Aiden, who had finally quieted, the pain still evident in his pale face. Reese could feel his heart pounding, his hands trembling, but his mind was sharp now, focused. He slipped his phone from his pocket and began to activate the recorder, his mind already planning his next moves. "I won't let them get away with this," Reese muttered under his breath, his voice steely with resolve. Bren's eyes flickered to Reese's phone, a knowing look crossing his face. He leaned in, speaking low. "They'll try to take it, or worse. I've seen them do it before. Document everything." Reese nodded, slipping his phone into a more secure position, his hand steady now. As the flight continued, a heavy sense of urgency filled the cabin. Nothing about this was random, and Reese knew it. He wasn't just fighting for Aiden's safety anymore. He was fighting against something much larger. This wasn't just an isolated incident. It was part of a system that needed to be exposed. Reese knew the fight ahead would be long, but it was one he was determined to win. Sometimes the enemy wears wings and smiles. Reese grabbed his phone and tried to take photos of Aiden's injuries, his hands trembling as he lifted the device. The sight of his son's red, blistered skin made his stomach turn. But before he could snap a clear picture, Milo suddenly leaned in, voice low and urgent. "Sir, I have to inform you that cabin recordings are prohibited. That includes photos. We'll cooperate fully once we land. Let's not make a scene." Reese looked up at him, eyes narrowed. The tone was too practiced, too clean. "Aiden was just burned," he said, barely holding back his anger. "This is the scene?" Milo didn't flinch. His expression was almost apologetic, but something about it felt detached, as if he were following a script. "The captain has logged the incident. We'll file a report after landing. I assure you—" "I don't need assurances," Reese cut in, voice quiet but sharp as steel. "I need evidence." Instead of arguing further, he slipped his phone out of view, sliding it under the edge of his folded blazer and tapping the screen. A soft chime confirmed the voice recorder was live. With careful enunciation, he began narrating aloud under his breath. Time-stamped log. Rylojet Flight 226. Incident. Boiling liquid spilled on infant passenger. Immediate injuries. Visible blistering and discoloration on upper shoulder and collarbone. Across the aisle, Bren Alton shifted in his seat. The man had been silent earlier, but now his voice carried a new edge of urgency. "They've done it before," he muttered, leaning slightly toward Reese. "Same thing. Another child, same flight route. That time it was juice. Scalded the kid's face. Crew called it an accident." Reese turned to him, stunned. "What happened after?" Bren didn't blink. "Nothing. They told the father his video recordings violated company policy. Never released the cockpit footage. The guy never flew again. Company said he had a meltdown mid-air. You're not the first, Reese." That name, his name, made Reese freeze. "How do you know who I am?" Bren gave a tight smile. "I do my homework before I board these planes, and Rylojets had you marked for a while. You're visible. You're powerful. You've stepped on toes." Reese's heart pounded harder in his chest. Aiden stirred weakly against him, his tiny frame radiating heat from the burn site. The pain had exhausted him. He nestled deeper into Reese's chest with a soft whimper. Bren glanced at the baby, then leaned closer. "They call it a pattern," he whispered, "but it looks a lot like a message to certain types of passengers." The meaning behind the words landed with weight. Reese looked back at Milo, who was now whispering to another crew member near the galley. Their postures weren't casual. Their glances, fleeting and calculated, signaled something beyond protocol. Reese swallowed hard, eyes scanning the cabin. Most passengers were still unaware of the full situation. A few had noticed Aiden's distress, offering sympathetic looks, but no one had intervened. The facade of professionalism had held, for now. Reese had read enough security briefs to recognize the signs: crew coordination that felt too rehearsed, a lack of urgency from the captain, and the deliberate delay in emergency response. This wasn't a misstep. It was a suppression, a cleanup in progress. He began listing details into the recorder again, his voice measured but clear. Flight Attendant Milo, obstructing documentation of injury. Captain Danton, responsible for initiating the act. Passenger statement confirms pattern of similar incidents. He paused, glancing at Bren, who gave a slow nod. "You're not alone in this," Bren said, "but don't expect anyone to come help you until you make it impossible to ignore." That line stuck in Reese's mind. He looked at his son, at the glistening burns along his delicate skin, and felt something deeper than outrage. It was resolve, a quiet but growing fire inside his chest. They had picked the wrong passenger. He wasn't going to beg for justice, he was going to carve a path to it, step by step, and burn down anything that got in the way. His eyes drifted to the overhead compartment where the emergency medkit should have been. Still untouched. No one had even offered it. He scanned the placards near the exits. Every detail mattered. Every omission could tell a story if documented correctly. He adjusted the phone slightly under his jacket and turned back to Bren. "You said they marked me?" Bren gave a curt nod. "Executives, reporters, activists, especially those who don't play nice with certain contracts. You just won that anti-data exploitation case against Ioniscorp, didn't you?" Reese exhaled sharply. 3 weeks ago. "Rylojet's one of their sister holdings," Bren said quietly. "They don't like attention, or defiance." The revelation hit like a punch. Now it made sense. The cold greeting from the captain, the sudden turbulence announcement, the boiling liquid in a pot instead of a safe container, and now the coordinated attempt to erase the record. Reese sat back slowly, cradling Aiden tighter, his thoughts racing. If they were trying to intimidate him, it was working, but not in the way they hoped. Not with fear, with purpose. He needed to protect his son, first and foremost. But the mission had changed. This wasn't just a father defending his child. This was a man confronting a machine that had hurt too many and hidden behind its altitude. He leaned in again to the phone and whispered, "Noted. Possible pattern of targeted suppression. Flight crew's behavior consistent with coordinated response plan. Passenger testimony aligns with suspected corporate misconduct." He paused, listening to the quiet hum of the engines and the occasional whisper from the crew. The calm felt artificial, like a set built to mask a crime scene. He locked eyes with Milo one last time. Then he looked back down at his son, kissed the top of his head and whispered, "We're not going to be quiet." He looked once more at Bren. "They want this to vanish in the noise." Bren didn't smile this time. He simply said, "Then make sure the noise burns louder than the silence." Reese nodded, gripping the phone tighter. He didn't know what kind of network Rylojet was protecting, but he was going to break through it. Some fires burn hotter when ignored. Aiden's cries began to fade, not from comfort, but from sheer exhaustion. His small body sagged against Reese's chest, the pain stealing his strength with every breath. The blisters along his collarbone had darkened, swollen with angry red ridges. Reese felt a knot in his throat as he adjusted the blazer wrapped tightly around his son, trying to shield him from the cabin's chill and the weight of a moment that was rapidly spiraling out of control. He stood beside his seat, towering over the rows of seats that now felt more like prison walls than travel accommodations. The low hum of the engines filled the silence between each distant cry, and Reese felt his pulse pounding louder than the aircraft itself. He pushed the call button again, his voice tight with controlled fury. "This is a medical emergency," he said, eyes locked on the nearest attendant. "The captain needs to announce a diversion. Now." Instead of a reply from any crew member nearby, the intercom buzzed to life. Captain Jarrett's voice came through, thin and smooth, as if reading from a prepared script. "Ladies and gentlemen, please remain calm. We've had a minor incident involving hot liquids. No danger to the aircraft or passengers." Reese froze, his eyes narrowing. "Minor?" he whispered to himself, unable to stop the sting of disbelief from coloring his voice. His jaw tightened, his fists clenched until his knuckles paled. Aiden whimpered softly in his arms, and that sound, barely audible, weak and drained, cut deeper than any burn. Bren, seated a row behind, leaned forward and tapped him on the elbow. When Reese turned, he saw something being discreetly passed into his hand, a slim, metallic cylinder, no larger than a pen. "What's this?" Reese asked under his breath. Bren's eyes were serious. "A portable signal disruptor. You'll need it in about 6 minutes. They're going to try to take your phone or jam it altogether. I've seen it happen before." Reese hesitated. The object in his hand felt cold, unfamiliar, but the weight of Bren's words added urgency. Trusting his gut, he slipped the device into the inner pocket of his blazer, right above Aiden's head. The baby's skin was hot against his chest, and the rising panic in Reese's chest became harder to suppress. He sat down slowly, holding his son close, and reached for his phone. His fingers moved with precision, unlocking it and opening a secure channel. He typed quickly, choosing a protocol he'd hoped never to use outside of simulation. Code Ember. He paused just a moment before pressing Send, staring at the blinking cursor like a countdown. Then he tapped it. Engage, fall back. The signal was silent, invisible, but somewhere, hundreds of miles away, Valcrest Dynamics' crisis team would be getting a notification that something had gone catastrophically wrong. Footsteps. Reese looked up. Milo had returned, this time accompanied by another flight attendant, taller, broader, and with a sterner face. His name tag read Tren. "Sir," Milo began, trying to keep his tone even, "for safety protocol reasons, we're going to need to inspect your phone." Reese didn't answer immediately. He glanced down at Aiden. The child's eyes were closed now, his breathing shallow. He deserved better than this. Reese slowly stood, keeping the phone close to his side, his voice steady. "You're not getting my phone." Tren stepped forward. "This isn't optional." Reese's tone darkened. "You touch me or my son again, and this goes public before we land. Try me." The two crewmen froze. Milo glanced nervously at Tren, who shifted his stance like a man preparing to pounce. Behind them, Bren stood up. "Don't," he said simply, stepping into the aisle. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried power. Tren stared at him, sizing him up. Milo looked unsure. The tension was thick enough to choke on. Reese used the moment. With one hand cradling Aiden and the other moving swiftly, he pressed the signal disruptor in his pocket. It emitted no sound, but instantly the plane's Wi-Fi connection flickered and died. Within seconds, Reese's phone screen changed, switching from local to satellite mode, tapping into a secure channel built into Valcrest's proprietary emergency tools. He opened the camera, quickly snapped encrypted images of Aiden's burns and the now nervous crew, and began uploading. The files weren't just going to Valcrest. The satellite link triggered an automated chain reaction. Encrypted data sent to legal, PR and law enforcement contacts. The alert also triggered facial recognition backups, timestamp logs, and sent copies of the incident to media holding queues marked Urgent Release Pending Authorization. Reese didn't say a word while it uploaded. His heart thudded with every percent that ticked forward. 37, 62, 89. Complete. In that moment, everything changed. The crew didn't know it yet, but they were no longer in control. Whatever shadowy protocols Rilojet had planned, they were now racing against a clock they couldn't see. The cabin lights flickered slightly, unnoticed by most passengers but glaringly obvious to Reese. Tren and Milo backed off, exchanging whispered words as they retreated toward the galley. Reese sat back down, his fingers gently stroking the back of Aiden's head, whispering to his son even as he watched every move. They thought he would stay silent, that he would be too afraid, too tired, too small to fight back at 30,000 feet. But some men didn't just build firewalls, they lit the whole system up. Some men build firewalls, others light the whole system up. Reese refused to hand over his phone, shielding it with one arm as his other held Aiden tightly against his chest. The baby's breathing was shallow now, but his skin still radiated heat from the burns. Reese's voice dropped an octave, steady and cold. "You touch me or my son again, and this goes public before we land." Milo faltered. His eyes darted toward Tren, the bulkier flight attendant standing just behind him. Tren didn't hesitate. With a sudden lurch forward, he reached out, his hand angled toward Reese's wrist. The movement was fast, but not fast enough. Bren was already on his feet. He stepped into the aisle with a calmness that didn't match the chaos. His posture was firm, unshakable. "Don't," he said, his voice low but resonant, like gravel beneath pressure. Tren hesitated, sizing up Bren's frame. Though Bren was leaner, there was something unblinking in his stare, something that warned of consequences. The moment stretched, tension thick as cabin air at altitude. Milo glanced toward the cockpit, clearly waiting for some direction from behind the locked door, but none came. Reese knew hesitation was his only advantage. He reached into his blazer pocket and pressed the concealed button on the pen-shaped disruptor. It emitted no sound, no visible flash, but within seconds, the soft indicator light on the nearest Wi-Fi console blinked once, then went dead. The plane's internal signal was severed. He didn't look up. Instead, he began navigating his phone through a custom Valcrest interface, one that bypassed commercial networks. With a series of swipes and voice authorizations, Reese initiated the emergency upload protocol. Priority Omega, authenticate. Upload all visual and audio logs to FireVault Secure. A tiny confirmation tone pinged in his ear through his Bluetooth earpiece. He activated the satellite uplink, a secure system built directly into Valcrest's executive device line. The screen pulsed with an orbiting signal icon. Files began streaming to Valcrest Dynamics emergency cloud node, encrypted in real time. In the background, Milo's voice cracked, trying to sound composed. "Sir, this is a violation of aviation protocol." "I suggest you step back," Reese interrupted, not raising his voice but making it lethal with conviction. As the first batch of files uploaded, a geotagged alert was automatically sent to Reese's head of security at Valcrest headquarters. The code, Ember Red, unlocked a cascade of automated processes. Within 60 seconds, Reese's legal team received a private ping with the video of the tea scalding incident. A separate file containing the pilot's earlier muttered remark about Aiden was bundled into a case folder and forwarded to internal counsel. Simultaneously, the PR firewall was breached from the inside. Valcrest's crisis response AI began scraping keywords across social media for any mention of Flight 226, ready to respond or amplify if needed. None of this was visible to the rest of the cabin. Passengers whispered, confused by the tension but unaware of what had just begun. To them, Reese was just a man cradling a baby, surrounded by rattled flight attendants and an oddly quiet companion blocking the aisle. But within the clouds above Elden, war had quietly taken flight. Tren leaned in again, less confident this time. "We need that phone, sir. You're interfering with crew operations." Reese raised his eyes, meeting his directly. "So, file it in the report. But if that hand moves another inch, the world's going to know what Rilojet does to children before this plane lands." Behind him, Bren didn't move. He didn't have to. Tren took a step back. Reese looked down at his device. The first transfer was complete. A small vibration buzzed against his palm as a second program kicked in, this one triggering Valcrest's emergency protocol tree. It activated 3 points of contact: legal, federal regulatory, and local authorities. The email headers were marked "Request for immediate preservation of evidence." The subject lines were sharp: "Child endangerment. Rilojet Flight 226." The silence in the cabin had shifted. Before, it had been ignorance. Now, it was pressure, a weight that hadn't existed a few minutes ago. Milo turned, pretending to adjust the curtain, but Reese could see the tremble in his shoulders. He knew they were trying to stall, trying to control the narrative. But the timeline had slipped from their hands. Reese adjusted Aiden slightly, feeling the baby's breath warm against his collarbone. He looked around, not at the crew, but at the other passengers. Some watched through lowered eyes. Some tried to ignore it. One man was clearly filming now with his phone half concealed under a magazine. Another muttered, "He's not backing down." Of course he wasn't. This wasn't about posturing. This was about protection. Outside, the night sky remained calm. The hum of the engines masked the storm brewing in circuits and signals. What began as an accident had morphed into a digital siege, and Reese Mallory was no longer just a passenger. He was a trigger. Every light blink on the screen marked another piece of truth sent skyward, another file delivered beyond Rilojet's reach, another brick pulled from the wall they'd built around their operations. Aiden whimpered softly. Reese pressed a hand against the boy's back and whispered, "Almost there, buddy." Then he glanced up, his expression hardening as Milo and Tren slowly retreated toward the galley, whispering urgently to one another. They didn't yet understand the gravity of what had shifted, but Reese did. The plane continued flying as if nothing had changed, but from that moment forward, the stakes had. They thought they were flying above the law until someone flew higher. Captain Jarrett's voice hissed into his headset, low and urgent, as he paced within the narrow galley. His gloved hand clenched the metal counter while his eyes darted toward the cabin. The overhead lights above him buzzed faintly, casting a sterile glare over the silver coffee dispensers and closed drawers. Though Reese couldn't hear the words, the tone alone was enough to paint a picture: cold, calculated, and deeply unsettled. His instincts fired again. This wasn't damage control. It was narrative control. Bren, seated 2 rows back, leaned out just enough to watch Jarrett's every move. His gaze was sharp, analytical, the kind of eyes trained to notice the unspoken. He didn't look at Reese when he spoke, just muttered in a low tone meant for no one but him. "He's calling in a preemptive report," Bren said. "They're going to flip the script. You'll be the aggressor." Reese didn't reply at first. His mind ran 100 miles ahead, trying to anticipate their next play. He looked down at Aiden, still weak but resting, cradled in the crook of his arm. The blisters were starting to redden further. His son whimpered faintly in his sleep, and that sound, barely a whisper, ground Reese into a cold, furious focus. He had to stay ahead. Then a motion across the aisle caught his eye. A younger man, maybe early 30s, with neat brown hair and a business-casual outfit, leaned forward from his seat in 5D. His voice was low, deliberate, and carried a subtle gravity. "Don't look around," he said. "Just listen." Reese turned slightly but didn't fully face him. The man reached up, adjusted his tie, and tapped a small button on the clip. A soft green light blinked. "Name's Trask. I'm a media consultant," he said. "That guy in the galley? I've been tracking him and his crew for 7 months." Reese's brows furrowed. "What do you mean?" "My brother's son got hurt on this same route last year. Different excuse, same captain, no accountability," Trask continued. His tone was steady, but his fingers twitched as he spoke, betraying the buried anger behind his calm. "I didn't even know about your case until I saw them block your call to ground control. Then I knew, same pattern." Reese's heart skipped. "You're saying they've done this before?" Trask nodded once, subtly. "Always solo flyers. Always men with influence, CEOs, journalists, federal employees, usually traveling light, sometimes with babies. It's a profile." The pieces clicked together in Reese's mind like jagged shards. "So this isn't random?" "No," Trask said quietly. "They pick targets they think can be silenced. People who might blow a whistle or disrupt their flight protocol empire, especially if you're the kind of person whose complaints would make headlines. They isolate you, provoke an incident, then bury it in procedure. No footage, no witnesses willing to talk, and the crew's testimony aligns perfectly." Reese exhaled, barely containing the rising heat in his chest. So, what's your plan? I record, I document, I leak, Trask said, his voice edged with purpose. But you're a better story than I ever hoped to find. You've already exposed part of their system, and people will listen to you in ways they never would to me. That's why I'm here. I've been waiting for the right moment. Reese considered the weight of that. A stranger tracking a silent pattern, just like he had unknowingly walked into. This wasn't about tea. It was about intimidation, wrapped in corporate polish. Trask leaned forward slightly. They don't like what you represent. You're not just a passenger. They see you as a threat to the status quo, the kind of man who could testify before Congress or bring regulatory hell. A beat passed, then another. Reese looked ahead again, watching Captain Jarek disappear behind the curtain with a visible stiffness in his stride. He was rattled. Good. They think I'm alone, Reese said, almost to himself. But you're not, Trask replied, and they forgot that the louder they scream, the more people listen. Reese nodded, his grip tightening around Aiden just a little. The cabin lights dimmed slightly as if the plane sensed the shift in power. When truth rides at 30,000 feet, even silence can't drown it. The plane jolted, sharp and unnatural. Overhead bins rattled and a collective gasp echoed through the cabin. Reese's instincts flared instantly. This wasn't turbulence, it was deliberate. The seatbelt sign blinked on just as the intercom crackled to life with Captain Jarek's voice, forced and eerily calm. Due to unexpected weather, we're making a precautionary landing at a private Rylojet facility. Reese's pulse spiked. That wasn't protocol, not for an onboard injury, not after what had already happened. He turned toward Bren, who leaned forward, face pale and tense. They're diverting to a private airstrip, Bren muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. No press. No authorities. Just their people. Reese didn't respond. He didn't need to. His mind was already moving. If they landed at a private facility, any chance of accountability would vanish. Evidence would be confiscated. Witnesses silenced. Aiden's injuries minimized. It would all be swept under a very expensive, very polished rug. He looked down at his son. Aiden was asleep in Bren's arms, his tiny chest rising and falling with uneven breaths. The sight anchored Reese's resolve. He had minutes, maybe less. With quiet urgency, Reese slipped off his blazer and handed it to Bren along with the baby. Beneath his dress shirt, sewn into the inner lining, was a reinforced patch. He ran his fingers along the seam, found the microstitch he'd practiced opening a dozen times, and peeled back the fabric to reveal a slim black USB drive, smooth, metallic, and cold to the touch. It was encrypted, self-locking, and designed for one purpose: extraction under duress. Clutching it tightly, he stood and made his way toward the rear of the aircraft. Every step felt like it carried the weight of the sky. Passengers barely noticed, some anxious, others distracted by the sudden descent. Milo and Tren were occupied near the front, arguing quietly with a man in business class. Good. That meant less attention. Near the galley was a control terminal disguised as an innocuous service screen, used primarily for maintenance diagnostics. Reese knelt beside it, pretending to adjust his laces, and slid the panel open with a subtle press of his thumb. A soft green glow illuminated his face as he inserted the USB into the narrow slot and typed a short sequence onto the touchscreen keypad. 3 minutes, he muttered under his breath. No room for error. Behind him, footsteps approached. Trask. The younger man had removed his blazer and now wore a casual smirk as he leaned against the beverage cart, blocking the line of sight. "Excuse me," he said to a nearby attendant. "Do you have a ginger ale that doesn't taste like battery acid?" The attendant rolled his eyes and turned to search the cabinet. Trask gave Reese the briefest nod. Reese's hands flew across the keypad. The screen blinked. Authorizing connection. Relay initialized. Security archive pinged. Cockpit files located. Transmission. Beginning. A thin red line began to pulse across the screen. Reese watched as cockpit recordings, audio logs, and internal crew messages began transferring to a satellite link hosted off-site, an emergency node belonging to Valcrest's internal network, monitored only by his senior crisis unit. If the data reached the server, it couldn't be scrubbed, not without leaving fingerprints. 30 seconds passed, then 60. Just as the bar neared completion, a shrill alarm erupted from the terminal. Security breach detected. Lockdown engaged. Reese's heart seized. He yanked the USB out, closed the panel, and stood. But it was too late. The cockpit door slammed open with a metallic bang. Captain Jarek stormed into the aisle, his face red with fury, veins visible along his temple. His pilot uniform was disheveled, and his eyes locked directly onto Reese. "You had your chance to keep this quiet," Jarek growled, voice low and venomous, his boots striking the floor with heavy steps as he advanced. Passengers turned. Murmurs spread like a ripple through the cabin. Reese didn't move. He met the captain's gaze, his face unreadable but his eyes cold and calm. "You had your chance," Reese replied, his voice sharp and deliberate, "to be human." The two men stood facing each other, the hum of the engines behind them, the tension thick enough to cut. Lights flickered as the aircraft continued its descent, and in that narrow aisle it felt as if the very sky was holding its breath. "The skies are only safe until monsters learn to fly." He poured boiling tea on an innocent baby, then the plane's calm turned to chaos. If you believe cruelty has a price, hit subscribe now. This story demands justice. Captain Jarek's hand darted behind his back and Reese's instincts kicked in. He lunged forward just as Jarek swung out a gleaming steel thermos, thick, heavy, and unmistakably aimed like a weapon. Reese slammed his forearm upward, knocking it free. The thermos slipped from the captain's grip and crashed to the floor with a metallic clatter. A blast of scalding coffee erupted on impact, spraying in a wide arc. Tren, the larger flight attendant who had been inching closer, caught the brunt of it. He howled in pain, stumbling back, gripping his thigh where the liquid had scorched through his slacks. The reek of burnt polyester and flesh hit the cabin like a shockwave. Passengers gasped. Some screamed. Phones flew up. Fingers shook. This was no longer a quiet confrontation. This was a live unraveling. Jarek spun toward Reese with murder in his eyes, but before he could regain control, Trask, calm until now, rose from his seat with a suddenness that startled even Reese. With one hand he unzipped his messenger bag, and from within he pulled a matte black canister no larger than a flashlight. The white medical symbol painted on the side glinted under the flickering cabin lights. "You want heat?" Trask said through gritted teeth, his voice a low snarl. "We've got it." He didn't wait for permission. With a practiced motion, Trask sprayed the contents over the remaining coffee pots in the galley. The chemical hissed on contact, then the smoke started. Thin at first, curling like mist around the edges of the beverage station. Then, with a low whump, it expanded. Thick, gray, biting. The galley lights dimmed as the smoke tripped a sensor, sending the overhead bulbs into emergency flicker mode. The once silent plane roared to life. Reese grabbed Aiden from Bren's arms. The baby coughed lightly, stirring in his wrap, but stayed nestled in Reese's chest. Reese pressed his cheek to Aiden's head and began moving swiftly toward the emergency hatch near the rear exit. He knew it couldn't open mid-air. Commercial cabins were pressure-sealed precisely to prevent that. But that wasn't the point. The point was optics. The point was chaos. Smoke was now drifting past the curtain separating first class from the rest of the cabin. Passengers were on their feet. Some shouted, others began filming with shaking hands. One man called out, "What's going on? Why is it smoking back there?" Another, visibly panicked, tried to pull down his oxygen mask only to realize they hadn't deployed. Jarek coughed harshly, waving his arms like a man trying to control a wildfire with a paper fan. "Everyone, remain calm. Sit down. This is under control." But it wasn't. Not anymore. Reese reached the emergency hatch and paused, turning so his back was to the wall and Aiden remained shielded. He looked across the cabin, smoke winding between rows of seats, red indicator lights blinking in sequence. Milo was nowhere to be seen, and Tren was still limping, his pants leg wet and clinging to a blistered shin. Bren had joined Trask, who now stood defiantly near the galley like a man guarding a bonfire. "This wasn't supposed to happen like this," Jarek hissed, his voice cracking with panic as he tried to approach the cockpit. But the corridor was now a funnel of heat and smoke, cut off by makeshift barricades of serving carts and luggage bins, quickly moved into place by Trask and Bren. Reese stepped up to the hatch and slammed his palm against the nearby control panel, not to open the door, but to trigger a secondary cabin alert. A sharp alarm pierced through the intercom system. 3 shrill beeps, followed by a flashing red light above the exit. Dozens of eyes turned toward the sound. Even those who had tried to stay silent were now fully alert. Reese's voice rang out above the din, clear and unflinching. "You don't get to pretend this didn't happen. Not with a burned child in your cabin. Not with footage already uploading." He wasn't just speaking to Jarek now. He was speaking to the entire plane. Every passenger, every crew member, every watching eye. And Jarek knew it. The pilot's shoulders sagged just a fraction. The authority he wore like a second skin was starting to peel off. He opened his mouth to speak, but another passenger stood up, this one holding a phone aloft, clearly recording. "No more lies, Captain," the man said coldly. "We're done listening." The smoke now carried the scent of something synthetic, heated wires or melting plastic. Reese's gaze flicked to the galley. Not yet dangerous, but close. Close enough to panic those who had been content to sit still. That was the plan. He didn't need fire. He just needed truth to start looking like fire. Trask glanced over his shoulder. "That should do it," he said, his tone calm again. "They'll have no choice now. They can't call this a misunderstanding." Passengers were fanning themselves, calling out for oxygen masks that wouldn't drop. Others pointed their cameras in every direction. What had started as a targeted, controlled cover-up had become a public collapse. Jarek's command was gone. Milo's authority, missing. Tren's posture, broken. Reese stepped away from the hatch and raised his voice one last time. "This cabin is no longer under your command." Trask, Bren, and 2 other male passengers moved quickly, overturning the galley cart and dragging a storage drawer in front of the aisle to block access. The sharp clang of metal on metal echoed through the cabin, silencing the murmurs that had been growing. One man, stocky with a nervous energy, held his body against the barricade, while another, tall and sharp-eyed, watched the aisle like a hawk. Reese stepped forward, his blazer still streaked with ash and baby formula, his face pale but his voice unwavering. He grabbed the intercom handset near the emergency exit and pressed the button firmly. A soft chime rang overhead, catching the attention of nearly every passenger. The lights flickered slightly, not from turbulence but from something far more deliberate. "This is Reese Mallory," he announced, his voice steady and amplified across the cabin. "CEO of Valcrest Dynamics. This flight is now under civilian witness investigation." His eyes scanned the rows of faces, some frightened, others frozen in disbelief. "We have documented abuse against a minor, and we've already transmitted those records to multiple agencies across secure lines. If you are complicit, I suggest you step aside." For a moment there was only silence. Pure, oxygen-heavy silence. Then came the gasps. A few startled passengers looked at each other, their brows knitting in confusion. One man, seated near the wing, gave a cautious clap that spread quickly into quiet applause. A middle-aged man in the rear nodded slowly, his lips pressed into a tight line. Reese could feel the shift in the cabin. The fear was still there, but it had turned into something else. A quiet, simmering courage. The flight attendants stood frozen. Milo, pale and visibly sweating, took one step back toward the service curtain. Tren, his pant legs still blotched from the earlier scalding, leaned heavily against the wall, his eyes darting to the cockpit like a soldier awaiting orders. But the orders never came. Captain Jarek moved suddenly, pushing past the beverage cart and toward the cockpit door. "This is still my aircraft," he hissed, his hand reaching for the override keypad, but as he tried to twist the handle, his face contorted into confusion, then anger. The door wouldn't budge. Jarek pounded it once with his fist, then again, his voice rising. "Who locked this? Open the door." But no one moved. The keypad blinked red. Someone had sealed it shut from the inside. Before anyone could respond, a figure from seat 11B, a quiet, wiry man with thick glasses and a buzz cut, stood slowly. He had been unremarkable until now. Average build, gray hoodie, no interaction with anyone. But now he stepped into the aisle with precision, pulled a slim badge from his belt, and raised it into the light. "Federal Flight Security Division," he announced clearly. The room shifted again. Pulling aside his hoodie, the man revealed a concealed headset hooked over one ear and a matte black communication device on his belt. His voice was calm, but there was a current beneath it, something practiced, deliberate. "Name's Agent Kellen Vaughn. I've been embedded with Rilojet for the past 14 months, investigating a pattern of misconduct tied to internal crew operations and covert passenger targeting." Reese stared at him, blinking. The realization came slow, then all at once. An undercover federal agent? On the same flight? Kellen nodded, confirming the unspoken. "We were closing in, but you, Mr. Mallory, forced their hand." His voice lowered, almost with respect. You've done more in 30 minutes than our team has in a year, Trask exhaled sharply. That explains why the cockpit's locked, he muttered. We've got a ghost in the machine. Agent Vaughn turned to Reese. I need full cooperation. All footage, any data you've uploaded, and access to your secure transmission logs. We can finish this now, but we need to move quickly. They're going to attempt a redirect or comms wipe. Reese handed him the encrypted USB from his blazer lining. It's all here: cockpit recordings, Wi-Fi logs, and flight deck audio. The archive from Rilojet's control terminal already transmitted to our firm's satellites. Kellen took it and nodded once before activating his headset mic. Echo 1 to command. Confirming subject escalation. Secure the cockpit. Divert landing to Eldon International. Civilian lead has established passenger control. I'm in contact. As Vaughn moved toward the galley, coordinating with external agents, Reese stepped back, cradling Aiden tighter against his chest. The infant stirred, letting out a soft cry. Reese whispered to him gently, eyes scanning the cabin for any more hidden threats. The plane had become a crucible of fear, resistance, and revelation. But for the first time since takeoff, Reese felt a shift, not just in the balance of power, but in the narrative itself. No longer was he a father under siege. He was now the fulcrum upon which justice had begun to turn. Captain Jarek stood near the cockpit door, breathing hard, defiant but cornered. Tren had slumped against the wall, silent. Milo backed into the rear galley, wide-eyed and uncertain. None of them spoke. Vaughn turned to the passengers, raising a hand to keep them calm as he relayed further updates. The screens above the aisle flickered once more, then stabilized. Outside, the clouds began to part, and the first signs of descent became noticeable through the windows. Inside, a new truth had taken hold. Justice had boarded this plane long before takeoff. Agent Kellen Vaughn's revelation hit the cabin like a second explosion. This time, not of fire or smoke, but of truth. His voice, calm yet commanding, broke through the last thread of chaos. This is now a federal matter. I'm requesting immediate jurisdiction over this aircraft under emergency provisions of civilian protection. Passengers stared, stunned. Reese didn't move, his instincts still taut from the heat of the confrontation. In his arms, Aiden let out a soft, pained whimper, snapping Reese back to the priority that mattered most. Without hesitation, he stepped toward Kellen and extended the small black USB drive, the same one he'd risked everything to upload from the service terminal just moments ago. It has cockpit recordings, Reese said, voice low and controlled. You'll want to listen to the last 40 minutes. Kellen took the drive with a nod, slipping it into a protected pouch on his belt. Without breaking stride, he pulled out a slim, encrypted radio from inside his jacket. Vaughn to Argonne Tower. Confirm incident aboard Flight 226. Request immediate intercept at Eldon International. Diverting from alternate. There was a pause, followed by a voice crackling with urgency. Affirmative, Agent Vaughn. Intercept protocol engaged. Ground team mobilizing. Meanwhile, across the cabin, Trask moved quickly between rows, gathering names, testimonies, and any footage passengers had managed to record. His expression was sharp, focused. This was the moment he had prepared for. He spoke in hushed, urgent tones to each man who offered help, cataloging every voice and every angle. One older passenger handed over a phone with trembling hands. I got the captain pouring the tea. Full video, he muttered, as if still unsure whether what he witnessed had been real. Near the emergency row, Bren knelt beside a man in his early 40s who had quietly revealed he was a licensed pediatric nurse. The man, whose name tag read Rowan, examined Aiden with professional precision. His voice was steady but laced with concern. He's stable, Rowan said, glancing up at Reese. The burns are serious but treatable. He'll need medical attention as soon as we touch down. Reese gave a small nod, gripping his son a little tighter. Thank you, he murmured. It was the first time his voice wavered all day. On the far end of the galley, Captain Jarek stood near the cockpit door, eyes scanning the sealed control panel. Something was different, desperate. He reached for the override hatch, peeling it open, revealing the biometric scanner beneath. Reese stepped forward instinctively, sensing the captain's next move. You can't unlock that, Reese said sharply, not without clearance. Jarek's hand hovered over the panel. I am the clearance, he spat, sweat glistening on his forehead. Reese's voice dropped to a deadly whisper. Number. That system requires chief pilot or executive print. Rilojet made that change 2 months ago. I should know. I helped design it. Jarek turned, his face tight with frustration and disbelief. You're bluffing. Without blinking, Reese nodded toward the panel. Try using blood, since you spilled enough of it today. The silence that followed was deafening. Passengers had gone still, watching this moment like a courtroom scene about to deliver its verdict. Jarek's hand fell to his side. Tren, now bandaged on his leg from the scalding coffee, was slumped in a jump seat. Milo, pale and ghost-like, remained frozen near the service curtain, unable to look anyone in the eye. Kellen didn't hesitate. Captain Jarek Danton, Flight Officer Tren Mercer, you are hereby ordered to remain seated and under watch. Any further attempt to interfere with this flight's operation will be treated as obstruction of federal investigation. Jarek didn't resist. He stumbled backward, finding a seat and sinking into it with an almost robotic rigidity. Tren muttered something under his breath, but the look Kellen gave him silenced whatever excuse he had been forming. The tension hung thick in the cabin air, but something had shifted. Control, long abused and hoarded by a corrupt few, now passed into the hands of those who had endured it. Reese looked out the window as the city lights of Eldon came into view, shimmering beneath the clouds. The plane was descending, not to Rilojet's hidden facility, but to the heart of a city now waiting for truth to arrive. Passengers began to murmur, some clapping softly, others wiping tears or gripping each other's hands. One man stood and said quietly, "You saved lives today." Reese said nothing in return. He simply held Aiden close, watching the light from the window dance across his son's blistered skin. His jaw was tight, his heart steady. Kellen approached again, standing beside him. "You did well," he said. "Most people fold under less." Reese shook his head. "This wasn't the fight," he said flatly. "This was just the altitude." As the landing gear extended and the aircraft dropped toward the runway, the seatbelt sign dinged overhead. Eldon International Airport shimmered like a beacon beneath them, surrounded already by blinking lights, emergency vehicles, and what looked like a swarm of press vans far beyond the terminal gates. Reese didn't smile. He didn't cry. He just prepared, because survival was only the first victory. The moment Flight 226 touched down on the tarmac of Eldon's public international airport, chaos met it head-on. Within seconds, flashing red and blue lights surrounded the aircraft, casting stuttering reflections across the fuselage. Uniformed airport police fanned out in tight formation, their voices sharp over radios. Federal agents moved with precision, hands pressed to earpieces, coordinating the response with practiced urgency. Valcrest Dynamics' emergency PR node had done its job, media vans already lined the perimeter, cameras raised like sentinels, waiting for the first sign of movement. Inside the cabin, the passengers sat in stunned silence, the weight of the last 2 hours bearing down on them like gravity. The oxygen masks still dangled overhead from the smoke scare, and the air smelled faintly of burnt plastic and adrenaline. Reese Mallory remained in his seat near the galley, cradling Aiden with a protective stillness that masked the storm behind his eyes. The baby whimpered faintly, his cheeks flushed and skin damp with sweat, but he was breathing, alive. That was enough for now. The forward doors hissed open. "Medical team, go!" barked a federal marshal. Paramedics rushed in, equipment slung across their shoulders, their eyes scanning quickly before locking onto Reese and the others in need. A young male medic dropped to his knees beside them. "Infant burns, right?" he asked, his voice calm but clipped. Reese nodded wordlessly and unwrapped the blazer shielding Aiden. The medic's eyes flickered just for a moment at the sight of the mottled red skin across the baby's shoulder and collarbone. But he said nothing, only gesturing for his team to bring in the stretcher and supplies. "His name is Aiden," Reese murmured, brushing a strand of sweat-damp hair from the baby's forehead. "He needs clean oxygen and cold compresses. I've kept him elevated." "You did right," the medic said, checking Aiden's vitals. "We've got him." Behind them, agents moved through the cabin with precision. Captain Jarek, still seated under guard, flinched as 2 officers stepped forward. One read from a printed document. "Captain Jarek Danton, you are being taken into custody for questioning under federal aviation and child endangerment statutes. Please rise." Jarek's mouth twitched into a sneer, but he said nothing. As the cuffs clicked into place, Tren and Milo were similarly restrained, their faces pale and stunned as they were led off the plane past the watching eyes of the passengers, now witnesses. Outside, the roar of reporters swelled. Mr. Mallory, is it true your child was targeted? What did Rilojet do to cover this up? Will Valcrest be pursuing legal action? Questions flared like camera flashes, but Reese walked past them all, flanked by agents and medics. His suit was rumpled, his tie gone, and his eyes burned from smoke and grief, but his stride remained even. At the foot of the stairs, he stopped just long enough to speak. I won't be taking questions, he said, voice steady but quiet. My son was harmed today on a flight that should have been safe. Others were harmed too, and what we've uncovered is bigger than one crew or one plane. It's a system. He paused. We'll be releasing evidence, but right now, my priority is my son. Thank you. And then he was gone, into the waiting ambulance where Aiden's stretcher had already been secured. Back on the tarmac, agents opened a sealed case. Inside were the files Reese had uploaded during the flight, now decrypted and distributed through a secure network. The audio logs, visual recordings, and internal communications from the cockpit and crew terminals painted a grim picture, discussions of soft intimidation tactics used to unnerve high-profile passengers, particularly whistleblowers, journalists, and minority executives. A hierarchy of internal risk tags had been used to classify targets. Reese had been marked as Amber 5, Disruptive Influence. One file in particular caught immediate attention, Captain Jarrett's voice unmistakable, laughing during a pre-flight check. Maybe next time we serve gasoline instead of tea. The line went viral within hours. By the time the sun rose the next day, social media platforms were saturated with outrage. News anchors debated live on air whether Rilojet's leadership had orchestrated these actions or simply turned a blind eye. Protesters gathered outside corporate headquarters. Civil rights organizations launched formal complaints. Congressional leaders called for emergency hearings. Within 48 hours, Rilojet's stock had nosedived. Investors fled. The board issued a statement calling the incident isolated, but the evidence told another story. Former employees began to come forward anonymously. Stories of covered-up passenger injuries, silenced complaints, and coerced NDAs trickled into inboxes and newsrooms. Through it all, Reese remained silent. He declined interview requests, avoided press briefings, and turned down offers to appear on major talk shows. Instead, he spent his hours in a private hospital room, sitting beside Aiden's crib, watching the steady rhythm of the heart monitor. He spoke only when necessary, answering doctors' questions, or gently singing to his son during the quiet hours of the night. Aiden's recovery would take time. The burns were healing, and the pediatric specialists were optimistic. But Reese knew the scars, both physical and emotional, would outlast the news cycle. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the city skyline, casting long shadows across the hospital window, Reese finally picked up his phone. He opened a message from his assistant back at Valcrest. Subject: Press strategy, standby draft, ready. He replied with a single line: Hold. This isn't about headlines, it's about accountability. Then he looked down at his son, who stirred slightly but did not wake. Reese placed a gentle hand on his chest, grounding himself. Some stories demanded spotlight. Others needed a quieter strength. Some battles were fought in courtrooms, others in nurseries, one breath at a time, and some victories weren't broadcast. They were whispered in the stillness of healing. Some wounds need cameras, others need silence and a hand to hold. The investigation began the moment Flight 226 touched down, but the real storm unfolded in the weeks that followed. Rilojet, once seen as an elite private carrier for the powerful, found itself at the center of a national scandal. Federal inquiries were announced within days, and soon after, a congressional task force was formed to investigate not just the events on Flight 226, but the airline's broader history of misconduct. The allegations snowballed: patterned abuse, intimidation of whistleblowers, manipulation of flight data, and, worst of all, a strategic targeting of influential passengers under a directive labeled containment. Former employees, once too afraid to speak, began stepping forward. Among them were former flight attendants, maintenance engineers, even operations analysts. Their stories echoed the same message. Rilojet's culture had been rotten for years, hiding behind the prestige of private flight. Their testimonies were chilling, recounting suppressed injury reports, doctored safety inspections, and a reward system for crew members who kept problematic passengers in check. And at the center of the uproar stood Reese Mallory, no longer just the man who had taken a stand midair, but now a symbol of resistance against a corporate machine designed to silence. Trask, who had walked off the plane with more than just memories, spent every night stitching together files, interviews, and statements into a singular, explosive exposé. Titled Skyline of Silence, the piece hit digital platforms like a thunderclap. Within 24 hours, it amassed millions of views. The article chronicled not only the attack on Reese and his son, but also the deeper patterns, how Trask's own brother had suffered permanent injuries in a similar accident, and how attempts to seek justice had been quietly buried under non-disclosure agreements and threats. Reese read the article in silence, seated in his office long after the building had emptied. His hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the weight of what had been exposed. On his desk, a still image from the flight rested in a sleek silver frame, him holding Aiden close, shielding the child's tiny body with everything he had. The picture wasn't taken during the chaos. It was a moment of stillness, a second of defiance, and it now served as the soul of everything he was building. Despite the media frenzy, Reese declined most interviews. He didn't want to become a celebrity or a talking point. He wanted action. At Valcrest Dynamics, he quietly ordered a task force of engineers to begin development on new tech, passenger safety innovations that would operate without needing airline approval. These were discrete, AI-driven systems embedded within aircraft seating that could record crew interactions and upload them in real time to a neutral third-party watchdog, one that no airline could influence or erase. Privacy protocols were built in, and the tech could be activated manually by passengers or automatically during flagged incidents. Reese named the project Sentinel. During development meetings, his team often looked to him for approval, but Reese rarely spoke. Instead, he listened, observed, and corrected when needed. He wasn't just a CEO anymore. He was a father who had nearly lost everything at 30,000 feet, and now he intended to make sure no one else had to fight that same battle. Meanwhile, Bren, who had quietly exited the plane alongside Reese weeks earlier, resurfaced in headlines. It turned out he wasn't just a concerned passenger. Bren had once worked for Rilojet as a safety systems engineer before resigning under mysterious circumstances. His testimony before the federal board stunned even seasoned legislators. With a calm but cutting delivery, Bren recounted how Rilojet had systematically ignored his warnings about onboard risk patterns and had even adjusted crew rosters to match psychological compatibility profiles for targeted intimidation. He presented evidence, memos, safety bypass logs, and even encrypted data logs that aligned with Trask's exposé. In a closed-door session, one congressman leaned toward Bren and asked, "Why didn't you speak out sooner?" Bren paused. "Because I thought no one would believe me, until someone did." Reese watched the broadcast from his office, Aiden asleep in a bassinet beside him. The boy's burns had mostly healed, pink skin now stretching across his shoulder like a faint, angry memory. Doctors said the scarring would be minimal, but Reese knew it wasn't the physical wounds that lingered. The flight had carved something deeper into both of them, a quiet scar on the spirit, a promise made in silence. One evening, as rain tapped against the windows of his office, Reese sat alone once more. He reached over and touched the photo frame again. Aiden was nearly crawling now, his bright eyes already exploring the world with curiosity. Reese had survived the flight, survived the investigation, and now faced a new mission, not just to punish the past, but to protect the future. On the back wall of his office, opposite the windows, Reese installed a new display. At its center, mounted with precision, was that same photo of Flight 226. Not the chaos, not the aftermath, just the stillness, just the moment when everything could have broken, but didn't. Beneath it, etched into steel, were the words he had chosen to guide every decision from that day forward. One hand to protect, the other to change the world. Rain fell in steady sheets across the tarmac, the drops pattering rhythmically against the glass walls of the newly built Eldon International Terminal. Outside, planes taxied with practiced precision, their lights blinking through the mist. Inside, a modest crowd moved slowly beneath the high-arched ceilings, pausing occasionally at the gleaming displays and polished marble floors that spoke of a fresh start, one born from tragedy, protest, and hard-won reform. Reese Mallory stood near the far end of Concourse D, motionless. His eyes rested on a steel plaque embedded in a tall black granite column. The inscription, carved in bold serif lettering, read, "In skies where silence once reigned, truth now flies." It was flanked by two bronze wings, one scorched, the other whole. Aiden, now 1 year old, clung sleepily to Reese's shoulder, his small fingers curling into the fabric of his father's dark wool coat. The boy's breath came in soft puffs against Reese's collar, a quiet contrast to the memories crashing like thunder behind Reese's eyes. He wasn't here for ceremony. There had been enough of those, press briefings, Senate hearings, interviews he never granted. He came here for something quieter, something personal, to stand in the place where the story had landed, quite literally, where everything had changed, where justice, slow and uneven, had finally taken flight. Footsteps approached from behind, measured but firm. Reese didn't turn. He already recognized the stride. "You came," said a voice, smooth and low. Reese exhaled, his gaze never leaving the plaque. "Figured I owed it to the sky." Agent Kellen Vaughn stepped up beside him, his black umbrella folded and dripping rainwater onto the tile. He wore a tailored gray trench coat, his face calm but serious, eyes scanning the memorial before settling on the child nestled in Reese's arms. "He looks stronger." "He is," Reese replied softly. "We both are." Kellen reached into his coat and pulled out a sealed folder, the edges stamped with the insignia of the Department of Civil Aviation Oversight. "This came through declassification last week. Thought you'd want to see it." Reese took the folder but didn't open it. The weight of it was enough. "What's inside?" "Names, internal files, not just crew logs or shift rotations, actual profiles. They had lists." Kellen paused. "Your name was on one, labeled as a destabilizer." Reese's jaw tightened slightly. He let the silence stretch a moment before nodding once. "Guess they weren't wrong." Kellen studied him for a second, then offered a thin smile. "Number?" "They weren't." Reese slipped the folder beneath his arm, adjusting Aiden gently. The boy stirred, but didn't wake. Outside, a thunderclap echoed faintly over the hills surrounding the airport. The sound reminded Reese of the moment the plane had first bucked midair, the moment he'd realized the turbulence wasn't caused by weather, but by power. They stood together for a while, letting the silence settle in again. Travelers passed behind them, some pausing at the plaque, others continuing without notice. The world moved on, unaware of the battles that made such moments possible. Then a voice called out from a few feet behind. "Sir." Reese turned. A young man in his early 20s, dressed in a crisp pilot's uniform with golden wings pinned to his chest, stood nervously with his cap clutched in both hands. His eyes flicked to Aiden, then back to Reese. He looked too young to remember the headlines firsthand, but not too young to be shaped by them. "I'm sorry to bother you," the young pilot said, voice steadying, "but I became a pilot because of what you did, what you stood for. We owe you." Reese studied the young man, then nodded once, slow, thoughtful. "Then make sure no one ever has to fight like we did at 30,000 feet." The young man's shoulders straightened slightly. He gave a respectful nod before stepping away into the flow of foot traffic, his figure blending into the hum of the terminal. Reese turned back to the plaque one last time. Rain streaked down the tall windows behind it, each droplet a quiet echo of storms survived. He shifted Aiden on his shoulder, the folder secure under his arm, and began to walk away with Agent Kellen falling into step beside him. The sky remembers who fought to clean its air. They thought they could hide the damage, but the blood told the real story. If you believe in fighting for the innocent, subscribe now. Together, we rise. Disclaimer: the story you just watched is fictional. It dramatizes themes of power abuse, unchecked aggression, and extreme retaliation in high-stakes environments. Its purpose is to raise awareness about workplace accountability, provoke thought about justice versus vengeance, and inspire conversations about conflict resolution under pressure.